Hello, my name is Tess Pirates, and today we are going to be talking about Beethoven and the effects of his deafness on his musical career. So something I want to let you know now is that throughout this presentation, there will be music playing from each one of his periods as we discuss each one, so that way you can hear some of what was common and popular in his time. So Beethoven's first period started from about his birth until about 1800s. He was forced to start playing at a very young age by his father, who wanted him to be like Mozart, in that he was very popular and well known in performing at an incredibly young age. Sadly, this did not happen the way his father planned, as he became more popular later on in his adolescence, eventually becoming the primary breadwinner for the family. So, he was employed as a court composer in Bonn, and his main inspiration at that time came from his surroundings. Whoever he happened to work for, be it the aristocrats that he was surrounded by, teachers that he was learning from, and family members that may have been pushing him in certain directions. Important parts of his life also came into play in that he would be employed by other individuals to create music for them and for people that they cared about. He also experimented with the popular music trends of the day and often incorporated dance themes from different parts of the world into his pieces. He taught lesson to the young aristocrats and other wealthy individuals as a way to make money, and many of his pieces at the time were small and ready for public playing. So some of the first symptoms that arose from his deafness began as mild ringing in the ears and extreme nausea. This is common with labyrinthitis, which is basically the swelling of the inner ear. Below here I have a picture of the inner ear. Basically what was happening was that entire structure was getting swollen, and it was actually caused by what they believe was a small cut, which got infected and led to increased swelling to the point where the ear just became useless. In one of my papers by Privet, they did a very good job. They looked at not only the diagnosis and what exactly labyrinthitis is, but they also looked at Beethoven's letters to and from people that actually combined to create a timeline of his deafness. So, as it says, extreme cases of labyrinthitis can cause deafness, which is what happened in Beethoven's case, sadly. And they noted many treatments throughout his life, and the only ones that were successful were the ones that involved fixing the stomach issues and making him less nauseous, and so he could actually retain food. However, nothing could be fixed for the ringing of the ears, and eventually Beethoven did accept this. So they noted that the actual deafness began in 1798, and they calculated that by 1801 he'd already lost 60% of his hearing and was totally deaf by 1816, and he died at 1827, so he was completely deaf for a very long time. So, as the music entails, we come to the second period in which the deafness is becoming an important factor of his music. With the change and his becoming more deaf, there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. He became more depressed. He was a lot less social. He wouldn't go out very much and engage in any kind of social events. And he was also very mournful for his music, which is completely understandable because he was going through a time where he was basically figuring out that his passion in life, the one thing that he was truly passionate about, wasn't going to be something he could do for much longer. So, as a result of his deafness, he had problems communicating, and it got to the point where he would have others write things down for him so that way he could read them and then verbally respond to what they were saying. So as a result, there are a lot of written documentation of things that would be asked of him, but his responses and how he was handling it isn't very well known because all of his responses were verbal. As for his compositions, he really buckled down, and he turned more from public performances, like in his first period, to more private composing, and he would work on several pieces at a time. He also became more driven to marry. There were several women in his life, none of which he actually ended up settling down with. As a result, we get the Moonlight Sonata, one of the very well-known pieces that he wrote for one of the women of interest. His compositions as a whole also became a lot larger and more grand pieces meant for public performances. This meant that the orchestras themselves were much larger, and they were more typical of what you would find in the Romantic era. They told more stories and had more depth, much like what you hear right now. They were also themed more around struggle and celebration. A lot of people think that might have to do with his deafness, in which there's a problem that someone is trying to overcome, and then they celebrate their actual overcoming. So in the third period, he had at this point really established himself. He seldom had any financial troubles with all of the lessons that he taught in the past. He was also receiving lots of gifts from people that appreciated his work, and also he was being funded by several people who would give him money every month just to continue living and composing music. At the same time, he was also mentally riddled with failing love life, his progressing deafness, and actually issues with plagiarism. Melzel, someone who was supposedly a friend of his, actually took a piece of Beethoven's for his own and was starting to use it in different places around Europe. When Beethoven found out, there were legal ramifications that followed, but in the end, this actually increased his mistrust of those around him, even those that he cared for very much. At this time, his music took on a more contemplative style. There were a lot fewer produced, especially compared to the high-volume second period that he had, and he becomes fairly secluded as an individual. There isn't much interactions going on, and his health decreased very quickly. Also at this time, his music was considered strange in style and very different than what was normally heard. After he died, there were several perspectives that came up and were discussed about. It was universally decided that his later works were greatly affected by his deafness, but the different explanations for the same effect varied quite differently. The first one, the more prominent, was that the music was being used as a means to express and work through his depression. It was known that he wasn't faring so well, and it would explain the odd sounds and bizarre patterns that was heard. Another explanation was that he simply couldn't hear what he was composing, so that's why it sounded so odd. On paper, the pieces looked fine, but they didn't play as well to the ear. In another paper that I had by Knittel, Wagner, about 50 years after his death, wrote a review on his third period. He said that the deafness was used as a means for self-contemplation of his life, and it wasn't so much stigmatizing, but it was more enlightened and experimental, and he was basically using his deafness as an excuse to branch out and find all of these creative outlets. This paper and the idea was adopted throughout the world and subsequently has changed the view of his works for the centuries, and is often described as music before its time, with all of its greatness and strangeness of what was seen then is much more understood now. Thank you very much for your time, I hope that you enjoyed watching and learning about Beethoven's deafness, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me through Blackboard. Thank you very much.